The courtroom buzzed with tension as Elliot Hayes entered the room. A quiet man in his early 40s, he had always blended into the background. Today, however, that was about to change in a way no one could have anticipated. The case seemed simple enough, a routine police misconduct trial. The officers on trial, Rick Calloway and Mark Grayson, stood confidently at the front, exchanging smug glances as the proceedings began. They had dealt with plenty of these cases before, just another day in the office, they thought. Elliot, however, wasn't just another witness. No one in the courtroom, not even the judge, knew who he truly was. He wasn't there as a civilian, or even as a victim of the officer's misconduct. He was there as the Director of Homeland Security, and he had a personal stake in what was unfolding. Elliot stepped to the witness stand, his calm demeanor only making the officers more arrogant. Grayson snickered, elbowing Calloway as Elliot adjusted his glasses, glancing at the jury. They thought they had him figured out, just another powerless witness in a long list of inconsequential victims. But as Elliot opened his mouth to speak, a chill seemed to sweep through the courtroom. "Gentlemen, your lies are about to unravel," Elliot said in a voice that was as calm as it was chilling. The room fell silent. Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado fading. The smugness on Grayson's face evaporated in an instant, replaced by a look of cautious uncertainty. They hadn't expected this. "You see," Elliot continued, "the evidence against you has been manipulated. You may have thought your fabricated testimonies would hold up, but I know the truth." His words, delivered with such measured precision, sent a ripple of tension through the room. At first, the prosecution seemed convinced by the officers' stories. They were well-rehearsed, polished, designed to deflect any accusations of wrongdoing. But as Elliot methodically dismantled each of their claims, the cracks began to show. "The surveillance footage from the night of the incident," Elliot stated, pulling up a grainy video on the screen, "was altered. Your timestamps, officers, they don't align with the physical evidence on the ground. You can clearly see that the footage was tampered with." Gasps spread through the room. The defense, previously confident, now seemed rattled. Calloway's face went pale. Grayson clenched his fists, his knuckles white with the strain of holding his composure. But Elliot wasn't done. He paused for a moment, letting the tension build as the room waited for his next move. Elliot had expected their disbelief. He'd prepared for it. He knew exactly how to break them. "As for the testimony of Officer Grayson," Elliot continued, "you said you were in a different part of the city when the incident occurred, but your GPS data tells a different story. You were exactly 2 blocks away from the scene. In fact, you were there, watching the entire thing unfold." Grayson's eyes darted around the room, desperate to find some escape, but there was no way out. He knew the truth had been exposed. His alibi had been destroyed in an instant. The defense attorney stammered, attempting to salvage what was left of his case. But Elliot was far from finished. He had one more card to play, one that would turn everything on its head. "There's one final detail," Elliot said, his voice steady. "A key witness, Officer Malone, was set to testify for the defense. Yet he changed his story at the last moment, claiming he saw nothing. What caused him to suddenly forget everything?" The room fell into stunned silence. It wasn't just a casual mistake. Officer Malone's testimony was crucial to the entire case. But Elliot had already uncovered the truth. Malone had been coerced into silence. And Elliot knew exactly who was behind it. Suddenly, the doors of the courtroom swung open, and a figure entered, unexpected and startling. It was a federal agent, someone who had been working with Elliot in secret, a shadow ally whose involvement had remained hidden from everyone in the room. The agent's appearance was more than just an intrusion. It was a signal. The case had grown far bigger than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just about 2 corrupt officers. This was about a conspiracy, a hidden agenda that ran deeper than anyone could have anticipated. Elliot stood and faced the judge, his eyes never leaving Calloway and Grayson. "I think it's time to shut this down," Elliot said, his voice cold and commanding. "I've already taken the liberty of securing all of the evidence you thought was hidden. It's now in the hands of those who can do something about it. For the first time, Calloway and Grayson exchanged a look of real fear. The room was electric with tension, but just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, a loud bang rang out from the back of the room. Everyone turned in shock. The agent had fallen, a dark stain spreading across the floor. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He'd known this day would come. The conspiracy was far from over. The question now wasn't just whether the officers would be convicted. The real question was whether Elliot would survive long enough to see it through. As the lights flickered above, Elliot locked eyes with the officers, a grim realization settling over him. This was only the beginning, and the truth, it seemed, had a price. The courtroom went deathly still as the sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the chamber. Elliot Hayes' eyes snapped to the back of the room, where the federal agent had collapsed, blood spreading across the polished floor in an agonizingly slow pool. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, the entire world held in suspense. Was this part of the conspiracy? Had the officers finally gone too far? Had someone else pulled the strings from behind the scenes, making their move now, when the truth was too close to surface? The judge's gavel slammed against the wood, the sound snapping Elliot out of his daze. "Everyone remain calm," the judge commanded, his voice trembling slightly. "Security, get the paramedics in here now." Elliot felt the familiar surge of adrenaline flood his system. He had no time to think, no time to question. The agent's life was in danger, and there were too many pieces at play for him to sit back. But his mind was already working, calculating the next move. He had to stay focused. This wasn't just about the agent, this was about the officers, the corruption, and the system that had been silently broken for far too long. His gaze flickered toward the two officers who had been at the center of the trial, Rick Calloway and Mark Grayson. They stood frozen, but it wasn't fear that flashed in their eyes. It was the cold, calculating certainty of men who had orchestrated this, who had made sure their ties to the system were unshakable. And just like that, Elliot knew he had underestimated them. The game wasn't just about proving the truth, it was about survival. The days that followed the shooting were a blur of press conferences, legal battles, and mounting tension. The federal agent, a woman named Claire Jennings, had miraculously survived, though her recovery was uncertain. She had been rushed to the hospital, where Elliot had immediately made sure she was placed under heavy security. But he knew the attack wasn't just about her. It was a message to him: if he dug any deeper, the consequences would be grave. Yet, as the media continued to speculate and the public grew more vocal about the injustice of the case, Elliot knew that silence wasn't an option. His investigation had only scratched the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. There were still those who would stop at nothing to protect the system they had built, even if it meant erasing anyone who stood in their way. As Elliot sat in his office, sifting through evidence and arranging meetings with key witnesses, a voice on the other end of the phone broke his focus. "Elliot, you're not going to believe this," said the voice of Claire Jennings, still weak but determined. "I remember something." Elliot's heart raced. "What do you remember?" "The shooter," Claire said, her voice hoarse but sharp. "It wasn't just some random attack. I know who it was, and I know who ordered it." A chill ran down Elliot's spine. He had suspected this was more than a simple assassination attempt, but now the pieces were falling into place. There was a much larger network at play, and it was more dangerous than he had anticipated. It was late that night when Elliot received the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Claire's information had led him to a name, one that sent shockwaves through his body. Senator Victor Hale. The same senator who had been pushing through legislation that would grant local police departments unchecked power, ensuring immunity for officers involved in misconduct. Hale's connections ran deep, far beyond what Elliot had initially suspected. The senator had been an ally of the very officers on trial, ensuring their protection and even funding their defense. His ties to the underworld of corrupt law enforcement officials were well established, but they were hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and political maneuvering. The more Elliot dug into Hale's past, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about two rogue officers. This was systemic corruption, a conspiracy that had been operating for years, with Hale as its central figure. The officers were pawns in a much larger game, and the higher-ups in the system were determined to keep their secrets buried. But the more Elliot uncovered, the more dangerous it became. His every move was being tracked, his communications monitored. It was clear now if he wanted to expose this web of lies and injustice, he had to be careful. The system he was fighting against was far more powerful than he had ever realized. The tipping point came 1 week later, when Elliot received an anonymous tip. The information was simple. Senator Hale was scheduled to meet with a powerful crime syndicate in a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect opportunity to expose him and the connections he had been hiding. But it would be dangerous. If Elliot was caught, the consequences would be devastating. He had no choice. Elliot gathered a small team of trusted individuals who had been working alongside him in secret, and they set off toward the meeting location, their hearts racing with anticipation. As they approached the area, Elliot's mind raced through the possibilities. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. When they arrived, they found the meeting already in full swing. Senator Hale was there, accompanied by 2 of his closest allies, the very officers Elliot had been fighting against. The room was dark, the air thick with tension as they discussed the future of their plan. But they didn't know Elliot was there, watching them from the shadows. With a deep breath, Elliot stepped forward, his voice ringing out in the silence. "It's over, Hale." The senator's face twisted with shock, then anger. "You don't know what you're getting into, Hayes," he spat. "You're nothing but a pawn in this game, and you'll pay the price for interfering." Elliot didn't flinch. "I'm not the one who will pay the price. You are." A heated confrontation ensued, but it was clear who had the upper hand. Elliot had evidence, photos, recordings, and files that exposed Hale's ties to criminal organizations, his involvement in manipulating the judicial system, and his direct connection to the 2 officers who had once thought they were untouchable. Hale's allies attempted to flee, but Elliot's team was ready. They'd anticipated every move, every escape route. The criminals were apprehended, and the evidence was secured. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Senator Hale was arrested, his corruption exposed for all to see. The officers Calloway and Grayson were indicted, their careers destroyed by the overwhelming evidence of their misconduct. But Elliot knew that this victory was only a small part of the larger battle. The systemic prejudice and corruption that had fueled their actions still ran deep, embedded in the very fabric of the institutions they had trusted for so long. But for the first time in a long while, Elliot felt hopeful. He had faced unimaginable odds, confronted powerful enemies, and uncovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and law enforcement. And in the end, justice had been served not just for the victims, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence. Elliot had won, but the fight wasn't over. The system was still broken, and it was up to people like him to keep fighting for the truth. As Elliot walked away from the courthouse, he couldn't help but think of the future. The world had been shaken, but it was far from fixed. He had exposed the truth, but the work of healing and reform would take time. Still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had taken on the system and won. For now, that was enough. If you believe in justice, in standing up against corruption, and in fighting for what's right, join the fight. Subscribe and be part of the movement.